Chapter 5. The crunch of tires on gravel rolled through the farmhouse like distant thunder, echoing faintly through the walls before giving way to silence. Calvin lay awake in bed, staring at the exposed beams overhead. The sound didn't come again. He waited, still and tense, straining to hear anything that might suggest Abram had changed his mind. Nothing. The air was cold. He pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders and sat up slowly, reluctant to touch his feet to the icy floor. Morning crept in through the gaps in the curtains, pale and unforgiving. The house around him was quiet. Too quiet. Abram was gone. He hadn't said goodbye, not even close. Calvin stood and crossed the room, his joints stiff, the floorboards cool underfoot. He moved to the window and pushed aside the thin curtain. Outside, the road stretched beyond the barn like a forgotten promise, and the last of the dust from Abram's truck still danced lazily in the air. Wherever Abram had gone, he hadn't looked back. Calvin's stomach knotted. He told himself it didn't matter, that it was better this way, cleaner. But deep down, he'd wanted something, anything, a word, a reason, a hint that this was part of something bigger and not just him being handed off like unwanted cargo. Instead, he got nothing. A knock at the door jerked him out of his thoughts. "You planning to rot in there all day?" Winstead's voice cut through, followed by another impatient knock. "Breakfast is almost gone. And if I have to save you another plate, I swear I'm going to spit in it." Calvin dragged a hand through his hair, the gesture half frustration, half exhaustion. Yeah, I'm coming." "Then move it," Winstead called, footsteps fading down the hall. "Darby's already attacking his third plate." Downstairs, the chaos of the Tuckett kitchen roared to life around him. The long wooden table looked like a battlefield. Syrup spills, butter smears, crumpled napkins, and a jar of honey tipped on its side. Darby was hunched over his plate like a starving animal, shoveling food with wild-eyed determination. Mrs. Tuckett moved like a force of nature, her hands orchestrating breakfast with the rhythm of a seasoned general. Pans clattered, biscuits flew, and no one dared get in her way. Brooklyn sat at the far end of the table, cross-legged on the bench, absent-mindedly pulling apart her toast, her sharp eyes tracking Calvin's entrance. "Well, look who decided to drag himself down the stairs," she called out, smirk creeping into her voice. "Thought we were going to have to mount a rescue." Calvin didn't answer. He slid into a seat next to Winstead, who shoved a plate toward him piled high with pancakes. "Eat," Winstead said, around a mouthful. "You'll need it. It's fence post day." Calvin stared at the plate, appetite non-existent. Still, he picked up a fork, pushing the food around just enough to avoid attention. The room buzzed around him, Shelton and Darby arguing over bacon, Winstead sneakily stealing sips from Brooklyn's mug when she wasn't looking. The same familiar, chaotic normalcy. Brooklyn caught the shift in his expression and froze mid-toast. "So," she started, aiming for nonchalance. "Where'd Abram disappear to?" Her voice didn't fool him. She was fishing. Her concern was neatly hidden beneath sarcasm, but her eyes never stopped watching his face. Calvin forced a bite down, then said flatly, "Didn't say." Brooklyn tilted her head. "Didn't say, or you didn't ask." "I asked." He stabbed another piece of pancake. "He just didn't answer." Winstead let out a low whistle. "Ouch." Calvin didn't respond. Every glance around the table felt heavy, like they were waiting for him to explain something even he couldn't figure out. Like they were still trying to pretend he was one of them. Brooklyn wasn't done. "So what? He just left? Didn't say when he'd be back?" "Nope." Winstead leaned in. "Did he at least say what you're supposed to do when you get to the Truesdales?" A clink interrupted them. Paul, quiet until now, slowly set down his spoon. His eyes were sharp, cutting across the table toward Calvin. "No one said anything about doing anything," Paul said, voice steady and low. "The Truesdales are just keeping him out of trouble, doing Abram a favor. That's what this is, and he ought to be respectful of it." His words were flat, but something beneath them shifted, an edge, a weight that didn't match the surface meaning. He wasn't buying it either. Calvin held Paul's gaze. There was no challenge in it, just a tired sort of defiance. Paul stared back a second longer than he needed to. Winstead lowered his eyes. Brooklyn said nothing. The conversation had hit a wall. Paul picked up his spoon again. Doesn't matter what the patrioti do, as long as they stay out of our dirt, he muttered. But even as he said it, his eyes never left Calvin. Calvin stood. The chair scraped loud against the wood. I'll be outside. He didn't wait for a response. Brooklyn watched him go, then leaned toward Winstead. Her voice was softer now, less bite, more care. Just let him be. Winstead didn't answer, chewing slower than before. For once, he seemed to understand. The following weeks blurred into a quiet rhythm of hard labor and restless anticipation. Calvin kept himself busy, throwing his weight into whatever tasks Paul handed down, hauling fence posts, feeding livestock, fixing barn doors, and making countless trips into town. He wore his muscles sore and his mind numb, but the questions still hung heavy in the air. Where was Abram? Why now? Why this? Brooklyn stuck close, her presence steady and wordless. She never pushed, never asked. But she also never let him drift too far, always within reach if he needed her, which he wouldn't admit he did. Her company was like a railing in the fog, not comforting, but stabilizing. Winstead, on the other hand, filled every silence with speculation. He talked endlessly about Praxis, about what Calvin would see at the Truesdale's place, about what kind of ridiculous patriotti parties might be waiting. He asked too many questions, with too many smirks, half joking and half hoping Calvin would spill something interesting. But what Calvin found strange wasn't Winstead's curiosity. It was the tone underneath it. There was a hunger in it. Not just curiosity, longing. Praxis wasn't just a destination for Winstead. It was a dream. He disguised it with sarcasm, with exaggerated yawns and theatrical complaints. But Calvin could see through it. Whenever someone mentioned the city, Winstead's posture changed. His eyes sharpened, his voice lifted. He wasn't excited about another year at school. He wanted to go back to Praxis. He wanted to belong to it, out of Paul's reach, where he was free from responsibility. Paul's disdain for that dirty scar on the earth had been pounded into all of them like nails through old wood. He called the dredge parasites, people who gave up the right to be human when they let others do their thinking and working for them. They didn't labor, they didn't sacrifice. They just floated through life, comforted by indulgence and crippled by dependence. But Paul's words didn't stick to Winstead the way they did to everyone else. Calvin had noticed that for a while now. The way Winstead's eyes lingered on the pages of city catalogues. The way he spoke about the rig with too much excitement to be ironic. The way he laughed a little too hard when he said he'd sell his soul for a seat in the arena. He didn't want to escape the trap. He wanted in, and Calvin wasn't sure what to do with that. Eventually, the morning of departure arrived. The air bit colder than usual, sharp with dew and tension. Calvin stepped into the kitchen for the last time, his boots scuffing against the wooden floor. Brooklyn sat at the table, her fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. Winstead leaned against the counter, chewing noisily on eggs like he hadn't eaten in a week. Darby, perched on a stool, had already built a small fortress of waffles and gravy. Look who remembered to wake up, Winstead mumbled through a mouthful. We were about to leave you with the cows. Brooklyn didn't bother hiding her glare. You don't always have to be a jerk. Calvin ignored both of them and scooped what scraps were left onto a plate. So, what's the plan? He asked, settling onto the bench. Paul's taking us into town. Mom's always a mess at the train station, so she's going to see us off from here, Brooklyn said, her voice softer than usual. Catch the train. Then, Praxis. Winstead's smirk sharpened. Finally, real civilization. Calvin gave a half shrug. Sure, if you say so. Better than post-hole digging and sheep manure, Winstead said, jabbing his fork in the air. Praxis has lights, music, food that doesn't come from the same 5 animals. Brooklyn raised an eyebrow. And bars, and arena fights, and getting your pockets emptied by card sharks. Winstead grinned. You say that like it's a bad thing. Because it is. She crossed her arms. Paul wouldn't want us going anywhere near that mess. Winstead leaned back in his chair. Pa's not coming. You don't have to live your life in flannel and hay bales just because he did. Calvin cut in, tone neutral. A change of pace might not kill us. Brooklyn huffed, but didn't push the argument. Winstead flashed a smug smile, like he'd won something. The conversation dwindled, but the tension lingered in the air, like smoke after a burn. Outside, Paul finished strapping the last of the bags into the back of the wagon. Brooklyn ran through the checklist one last time. Darby bounced on his heels with excitement, too jittery to help. Winstead yawned dramatically, muttering about early mornings, but Calvin saw the flicker of energy in his movements. He was holding it in, barely. Paul turned to Calvin and gave him a long, unreadable look. Let's move. They climbed in, the wagon creaking as the small tractor tugged them forward. The dirt road stretched ahead like a rope to something unknown. Calvin kept his eyes on the trees as they passed, watching the last familiar shapes fade. The train station at the edge of town felt like something out of another world. It didn't match Chain. It didn't belong. Built with cold lines and hard stone, it rose from the farmland like a scar. Praxis architecture stamped into countryside soil. Brutalist pillars held up a roof of dark glass and rusted steel, etched with old engravings from a different era, symbols of progress that now felt more like warnings. The train waited on the far track. It was monstrous, sleek, angular, metallic grey, 40 cars long. Calvin counted. Only a handful were meant for passengers. The rest, cargo, crates of grain, stacks of boxed goods, livestock crammed behind steel bars. The spoils of Ecane, bound for the city's belly. The dredge didn't work for food. They waited for it to arrive. Calvin shouldered his bag and stood with the others, staring up at the behemoth. Winstead tried to act unimpressed, but failed. He was practically vibrating. Feels real now, doesn't it? Winstead said, voice low. Yeah, Calvin replied. Too real. Paul's jaw clenched. His arms were crossed, his mouth a flat line. He looked like he wanted to punch the train. Like if he could destroy it with a glare, he would have done it years ago. He hated that train, hated where it took his kids every year. But the law was clear. Without a praxis education, none of them could live freely in the outlying territories. It was either go to school in the city or be relocated. Time to board, Paul said at last. He didn't look at Calvin, just stared at the train, like it was swallowing something he couldn't protect. Calvin climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last. Brooklyn followed behind him, glancing back once at her father. Winstead nearly skipped up the steps, already craning his neck to get a look inside. With one final lingering glance at the Icane market behind them, Calvin stepped inside. The doors sealed shut with a hiss, and the train lurched forward. The massive engine tugged its heavy cars down the line, dragging them away from the dust and sunburnt fields of home. Calvin took a seat near the window, resting his arm against the cool glass as Icane slipped into the distance, shrinking like a memory already trying to fade. Winstead flopped dramatically across his seat, legs stretched into the aisle like he owned it. Well, boys and girls, he announced, his tone theatrical, we are officially on our way to civilization. Brooklyn arched an eyebrow and crossed her arms. Praxis isn't civilization. It's a pit. Winstead scoffed. A pit with electricity, endless entertainment, and food that didn't just fall out of a chicken yesterday. Yeah, Brooklyn muttered, and a whole lot of people willing to sell their souls just to get more of it. Calvin barely heard them. His fingers drummed a slow rhythm against his knee. The closer they got to Praxis, the heavier the feeling in his chest grew, like some invisible weight had fastened itself to his ribs. Maybe it was Abram's silence. Maybe it was the way this entire trip felt like the first step in something he wouldn't come back from. Whatever it was, it felt wrong. Footsteps echoed down the narrow corridor outside the small train cabin door. A tall shadow slid into view just before the door opened. A voice followed, smooth and self-impressed. "Ah, here we are. I was wondering where our little travellers had decided to settle." Percival Spivey stepped into the room, hands clasped neatly behind his back, his dark coat pristine, his posture so straight it looked unnatural. His sharp eyes swept the compartment like a hawk sizing up field mice. He was one of them, one of the patrioti, not the worst one you could hope to meet, but a patrioti nonetheless. They rarely left Praxis, but Percival was responsible for the outer territories. It was rotten luck Calvin found himself on the same train. "Ah, Calvin," he said, lingering on the name like it was a riddle. "Remind me, what was your last name again?" Calvin didn't flinch. He sat a little straighter, but kept his voice even. "Never had one. Abram never gave me his. Never made one up either." Spivey tilted his head as if examining a crack in fine china. "Ah, interesting." There was something in the way he said it. Not quite disdain, but something colder, something more calculating. It wasn't curiosity, it was confirmation. Less than, unclaimed, astray. Calvin didn't react. He forced his shoulders to stay relaxed and stared out the window, jaw tight. Across from him, Brooklyn had gone still. Her fingers curled around the edge of her seat, grip tightening. Shelton and Cranston exchanged wary glances. None of them liked Spivey's presence, and everyone knew he wasn't here for polite conversation. A second figure strolled in without knocking. "This is where we're sitting." The voice was smug, the kind that dragged out every word like it had better things to do. James Spivey. James's eyes swept the group, unimpressed. He wore the smirk of someone who hadn't earned anything, but still expected the world to bend. Didn't think they let dirt pounders ride with the real people. "James," Percival said mildly, "let's not be rude. Not everyone has had the same advantages." Percival smiled, but it never touched his eyes. "I do hope you're all comfortable." James made a show of shrugging. Hard to believe a dredge like Calvin managed to get himself a seat up here. Calvin's chest tightened. The word was expected, but it still hit like a slap. He forced himself not to move. James turned to Brooklyn, his smirk deepening. "Though maybe the company's not all bad." He leaned in, slow and deliberate. Didn't think farm girls cleaned up this well. Calvin sat up straighter. His vision narrowed. He didn't remember deciding to speak, but the words were out before he could stop them. "Leave her alone, James." His voice was sharp, sharper than he meant it to be. James straightened, eyebrows rising with mock surprise. "Relax," he said, hands raised. "I'm just being friendly." Spivey chuckled quietly, his eyes never leaving Calvin. "It's always good to see young men standing up for their friends," he mused. "Loyalty is rare these days." Brooklyn didn't speak, but she looked at Calvin, and something in her eyes shifted. He wasn't sure what it was. Surprise, maybe, or gratitude, or something heavier. The silence that followed was dense. Spivey gave his son a light pat on the shoulder. "Come, James. Let's not overstay our welcome." James offered Calvin one last smirk before following his father out of the cabin. As the door slid shut behind them, Brooklyn let out a slow breath. That was something. Shelton leaned forward. That wasn't a social call. He came looking for Calvin. Brooklyn nodded slowly. But her mind wasn't on Spivey anymore. She kept glancing at Calvin. She had seen him angry before, but this had been different. Normally he kept it to himself, stuffed it down deep inside, no outburst, no bark or bluster, just sharp focus, a protective edge. This time he took a risk snapping at a patrioti, a risk for her sake. And for some reason, that stayed with her longer than the insult. The train rumbled forward, fields and forests blurred by the windows. An hour passed in relative silence. The mood had changed. Winstead, never one to let tension linger, finally stretched with an exaggerated yawn. "So," he said, What's the first thing we'll see in Praxis? The lights of the rig? The blood pit? Brooklyn rolled her eyes. More likely a wall of guards and checkpoint scanners. Still better than cornfields and cow crap, Winstead said. Calvin finally spoke, his voice low. I doubt we'll have time to sightsee. Brooklyn turned toward him, reading the way he still wouldn't meet her eyes. You okay? She asked softly. Fine. He didn't sound it. The train began to slow, metal wheels grinding softly as they approached a long, looming tunnel. This is it, Shelton murmured. The wall. The steel tunnel stretched like the throat of some sleeping giant, its walls reinforced with dark metal and lit by flickering overhead lights. It seemed to go on forever, a brutal reminder that Praxis wasn't a place one entered casually. The cities inside it were protected, no, isolated from the rest of the world, hemmed in by stone and silence. As the train rumbled forward, the air grew heavier, charged with something unnatural. Then, without warning, they emerged into it. The energy field was almost invisible, like heat ripples on pavement. But its effect was immediate. Static crawled across their skin, and the low hum of power pressed against their eardrums. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, alive. Brooklyn flinched. Oh, I forgot how much I hate this part. Calvin's jaw clenched. The field. Praxis's power source. Winstead, on the other hand, was delighted. He reached out as though he could feel the energy between his fingers. Incredible. You can actually feel it, like we just stepped into a living thing. He grinned, eyes wide. It's like coming home. Brooklyn rubbed her arms. I didn't like it the first time, and it's worse now. It feels like something's clawing under my skin. Calvin nodded, sharing her unease. You don't get used to it. It's a reminder Praxis is different, controlled, engineered. Winstead kept grinning. And that means the arena's not far now. Finally, something worth looking forward to. Brooklyn gave him a sharp glare. The arena. That blood-soaked pit where people kill each other for sport. That's what excites you? Winstead shrugged, unfazed. Better than digging fence posts and watching sheep blink. At least in the arena, people matter. Or they try to. Brooklyn shook her head, disgusted. But Calvin barely heard them. The field was pressing tighter now, like it was aware of them, like it was measuring something. Look, Brooklyn said suddenly, pointing. A dug. Calvin turned his head. In the fields outside the city's reach, laborers toiled under the haze. But they weren't people. Not exactly. The Dugs, engineered to be tireless and obedient, were built like machines wearing human skin. They moved with mechanical rhythm, hauling massive crates. Digging, assembling, always bent beneath some invisible burden. Their clothes hung in tatters, barely functional. Their skin had a strange sheen to it, blue-grey and stretched too tightly over frames that looked like they'd been chiseled from raw power. Brooklyn's voice dropped. They're just left out there, like animals. No shelter, no care. Winstead glanced, then looked away. That's just how it is. They were made for it. Brooklyn turned on him, her eyes flashing. That doesn't make it right. They're used, broken, forgotten. She scanned the others for agreement, but found only silence. Even Calvin avoided her eyes. He wanted to say something, anything. But what? That he hated it too? That it made him feel sick? He didn't have the words, only a sick knot in his stomach. Brooklyn sighed, frustrated. She looked away, her gaze locking on a tall structure rising like a black tooth from the landscape. There's the power station. It loomed in the distance, humming with energy that filled the air with a low throb. It stood as a monument to Praxis's dominance. Cold, monolithic, alive. That's what's making us feel like we're being pulled apart, Brooklyn muttered. It's not natural. None of this is. Calvin nodded slowly. It's only going to get worse. Winstead leaned closer to the window, humming with excitement. And that means we're close. Look, there it is. Norwich. The city unfolded before them like a labyrinth of steel and stone. Towers rose in rigid lines. Roads crisscrossed in symmetrical, soul-draining order. Pipes ran across rooftops and vanished into the concrete like veins in a corpse. And at the center of it all, a single massive structure overshadowed the rest. The arena. It sat like a dark crown on the city, enormous and grim. Even from the train, they could see the banners, black and red, and the massive screens that flickered with frozen images of champions and killers. A place of spectacle, of violence, of glory. The train screeched as it slowed. Steam hissed. The station loomed. As they gathered their things, Darby hesitated. This place feels different. Winstead slapped him on the back. That's because it is. Don't worry, Darby. You're 12 now. Time to get your hands dirty in the real world. Brooklyn was already scanning the platform. Her brow furrowed. No one's here for you. Calvin shrugged like it didn't matter. Figures. You could come with us, she offered. I'll be fine. He tried to sound certain, but even he didn't believe it. She almost reached for him, but hesitated. He needs it. I know he does. But what if it makes things weird? What if it sets us back? The moment passed. She let it. Calvin saw the way she moved, the step she didn't quite take. For a second, he wanted to bridge the gap. Maybe a hug wouldn't have been so strange. Maybe it would have helped. But instead, he stayed still. The Tucketts turned and walked away. Their voices blended with the noise of the station, swallowed by the sound of machines and strangers. Calvin didn't follow. No one was waiting. No one had come. He shoved his hands in his pockets and stood alone, just another unclaimed boy in the churn of the city. Of course, Abram hadn't given details. Of course, Daxton hadn't sent anyone proper. He was used to being left to figure it out. That didn't mean it stopped hurting. Then, a shift, a sensation. The hairs on his neck prickled. A shape moved through the crowd. A Doug. It stepped forward, massive and silent. It wasn't dressed in the usual tattered leftover clothes most Dougs wore. It looked slightly more cared for. Its skin was the same blue-grey Calvin had seen before, but this one was different, more advanced, more aware. It stopped in front of him. You, come with me, now. Its voice was smooth, deep, and disturbingly calm. It didn't ask. It didn't threaten. It just expected obedience. Calvin stared for a heartbeat. Then he followed. The Doug didn't look back. Calvin trailed after it, swallowed by the crowd, his heartbeat keeping time with the steady hum of Praxis's monstrous heart.